In this video, we want to look at atmospheric perspective in landscapes based on old posters for the national parks. Now, originally, these were screen printed, and that's going to give you a very clean style like you see in these pictures. To put a little history behind it, back in 1939, Franklin Delano Roosevelt allocated a lot of money to employ unemployed artists to do lots of different things, paintings, murals, sculptures, etc., including 2 million of these screen printed posters like the one you see here. I live in Arkansas, so the pictures that I'm going to be doing in my classroom are going to be based on Arkansas sites. While not all of these posters were necessarily aimed at the park system, many of them were, and they shared many things in common. The use of atmospheric perspective and usually block lettering of some type, telling you where you could see these sites for yourself. Now, because they were screen printed, these posters are very graphically clean. The colors themselves may change, but they don't necessarily blend one into the other. There are a lot of flat areas with curved edges to make it look like one is a highlight or a shadow for another. And so before embarking upon this project, we're going to look at some of the things we want to have in our final result. We want a border and composition that makes sense. We want text that names the place, probably in two different ways. We want to use a reference image for colors at the very least, but probably for the shapes and the forms. The colors are going to be muted, creating more color contrast than value contrast, and on the tinted edge of the spectrum. Another stipulation is that the place be from Northwest Arkansas, and also that there be a foreground, middle ground, background. Think close up, far away, farther in the sky, and all the areas in between. So the first thing I want is a reference photo of some type, something that's going to give me an idea of colors, of shapes, of forms. I go to my phone, which is also my camera. I have friends that have sent me pictures, which I believe I'm going to use one of those. But I can also go online and look at the websites for area attractions, things that are actually in national parks or places in the city or the country that might be usable in this format. So here is the picture that I chose. I'm going to be using this, but I'm going to need to push the atmospheric perspective just a little bit more to make it really work for this poster. Also notice that the poster is supposed to be taller than it is wide, and this is wider than it is tall. Wide pictures are normally called landscape format, but in this case we want to do a landscape in a taller format, which we call portrait. In order to make this into a portrait format, I'm going to have to crop some of the picture. I don't want to just adjust the size of the picture because that might squish it and make it disproportionate. So to do that, I'm going to use some computer tools. I don't normally show how to use those types of tools in videos like this, so I'm going to allow you to do that on your own. If you're in my class, you can check the PowerPoint with all of the additional slides in it to do a step-by-step how to use your Google Suite in order to crop this to size and put a nice grid on it. When I'm done with the computer process, this is what I have. I have a very tight grid, 1-inch squares, on my destination paper, which is 11 inches across and 14 inches tall. It's a very standard size paper as well, so it can actually pop into an 11 by 14 frame. Here I have placed a pencil line grid lightly upon my painting surface, and you can see that it has been superimposed 11 squares by 14 squares over the original image. Now I have a black and white printer, which is why I have a black and white printout, but I can also work from my computer screen. Now you can see that since there are so many squares, I put letters down one way and numbers across another so that I can actually track them down if I need to. But really, I don't have to count more than about 6 or 7 at any given time because it's only 5 to the middle. And I'm going to start putting a contour line drawing. That's just the outside edge of all the dark areas, especially on this picture, square by square. I'm going to go slowly as I do this, making all those little notches that I can, realizing that I'm going to paint over this pencil line eventually, and any smudges that I make on it are going to disappear because the paint is going to cover just about everything in the end. Now remember, I said that I was going slowly. Also remember that in my videos I tend to speed things up. This is 20 times faster, literally, than I drew this image. And this isn't all of the drawing. I had to do a little bit afterwards from the computer screen because there were some areas that were just impossible to see in the black and white. Eventually, once I have everything drawn, I want to clean up, especially the edges, but also parts of the middle where I think that the paint is going to be a little bit thinner. I want to get rid of the grid. The grid is not going to be there in the end, and the paint will cover most of it, but making it easier on myself is what this is about, is making that grid really light so that I won't have to worry about covering it over entirely. I don't want any of the paper to show in the end. At the same time, I don't want the grid showing through. I also want a nice clean border on this, so I'm going to use painter's tape, and I'm going to tape about 1/4 of an inch over the edge. You can see through this tape, so you can place it on the front, and I've got more of it on the back than I have on the front. I have about 1/4 of an inch on the front and about 3/4 of an inch on the back. I'm going to do that all the way around, nice and neat, so that I can get a nice clean paint line all the way around and just have the paper on the edge. I also want to make this a poster with lettering, so I've done block lettering on the front using a printer, and I had it center it on my 11-inch wide paper, which will work very well, positioning it on my 11-inch wide poster. I'm putting dark graphite on the back of the letters so that I can transfer them directly from one piece of paper to the other by using pressure. In this case, I'm using a ballpoint pen, and it works very well. The letters are not necessarily positioned exactly like I want them, so I'm going to move them a bit so that the Arkansas is a little bit closer to the Bella Vista, and then I'm going to move the Loch Lomond down to the bottom when I get to that point. But I'm going to line it up with the edges so that it's centered and trace around all of the letters as you see me doing here. I have both drawn on the surface and transferred to the surface now. I'm going to transfer again after I've done a little drawing. Here's a little 1-inch tall piece of paper that I drew a fishing boat on. I just Googled a silhouette of someone fishing and drew it on a little piece of paper, and then I transfer it over using the same process. You can see there it is on the surface. When I do this, I want to keep things like overlapping, size, scale, and angle in mind. I'm going to speed this up considerably for the painting portion. Now, I'm an old watercolorist, so I like to put down washes first and then build up the darks, preserving the lights from the beginning. But acrylic doesn't always work that way. This is acrylic paint. It's going to go on a bit thicker. So what I am doing here is I'm putting in the sky and the colors that I see in the picture, and I'm mixing a lot of white into these. I'm tinting them out to get them really light. So I started with yellow and white at the bottom, and then I went to almost a pure white in the center, and then I started building up the violets at the top, trying to stay on top of the lines of the trees in the background without brushing them out entirely. And then I put in some cloud cover down below in little orangey colors. And as I go along, I'm building up the water then to reflect the sky and looking at the colors in my original picture as much as I possibly can. I brightened up some of them, but for the most part, I'm just sort of muting it all down, much like parts of the picture are. I'm going to let the brightness show through by the contrast of the oranges and yellows against the violets. I'm fairly certain that every color in this painting will be tinted, toned, or shaded in some way, bringing down the vibrant hues that would be right out of the bottle. Now you may notice that I've used quite a bit of white with this phthalo green here for this tree line in the background. I know that atmospheric perspective will take over and things in the distance will become lighter and less distinct. So I'm lightening them purposefully in the background to make sure that it looks like it's farther away, and I don't add nearly as much detail. And that detail part becomes fairly simple because my brush has a specific size to it and I can only put so much on there. You'll also notice that I put some different colors underneath the greens. That's my old watercolor techniques coming back, and they're not going to work in this case, but I don't know that yet in this painting. In acrylic, it's usually best to work with the opacity of the paint and bring back the highlights on top rather than trying to preserve them from the beginning. You'll see there that I tried to preserve them, and it's just not working out for me over in that corner. So eventually I'm just going to paint it all in. You'll also see that I have lost some of the lines, so I had to put in the ND on Loch Lomond and part of the L because the lines weren't quite dark enough to be seen through my paint. The opacity of the paint, the ability that it has to block out what's underneath it, is something that I'm not as used to as I probably should be. But you'll notice that I'm putting the highlights back on top, and these are the parts in the trees and the branches that would be seen through to the sky beyond. And I can put that back on top as long as there's some white or black mixed in with my paints. Different paints have different properties, and these acrylic paints, they tend to be translucent when they are a pure hue, but the black and the white will block out anything that they're mixed with. So if I mix things with gray, which is black and white or black, it will tend to block out and cover what's underneath it. If I don't, it will tend to show through a bit, and I might need to mix some gray, which is a good way of toning down your colors as it is. So if I'm going to tint, I add white. If I'm going to shade, I add black. And if I just want to tone it down, I tone, which means adding gray. All three of those methods will make it so that your paint is opaque, meaning that you can't see through it very well, and it will block out what's underneath. You'll see here also that I'm putting in some of the places where you can see through the branches, and I am also putting in eventually highlights in the green, where I have a darker green and lighter green highlights. I try to make little leaf shapes by using the end of my brush to make sort of these triangular leaf shapes. It doesn't always work, and sometimes I have to go back over the area. But in doing that, I make it look like they're individual leaves. If you look closely, you'll see that I'm working on textures in this area now. I'm trying to make sure that everything on the edge of all of the objects is sort of leafy in texture. It's not entirely random, but it's not very even either. So it's a process you sort of have to work through. And the nice thing about acrylic paint is it's very forgiving. You can build up layer after layer after layer. Oh, I don't like this layer? Paint over it with another layer and see what that looks like. Usually when you put enough layers on top of each other, you get a blend of all of the different techniques that you've used, and it works to your benefit. At this point, I'm going to go back and fix some of the problems that I had. I lost most of my letters, so I'm going to put them back on top. I probably should have saved this for last, to tell you the truth. I didn't realize it at the beginning. So if you don't put your letters on to begin with, that's fine. You can put them on at the end. I'm using the same lettering sheet with the same blackened background to transfer the letters back on top. The difficulty that I'm having here is the fact that some of the letters are still showing through, so I had to line it up very carefully to make sure that I'm going over where the original letters were so that any lines that were left still match. If I hadn't done it to begin with, then I wouldn't have to worry so much about that. I just need to make sure that my letters are square with the edge, and centering it on this 11-inch wide piece of paper allowed me to do that by just lining up the edges with the edges of my painting. As artists, we must be willing to go back and rework sections, making sure that everything is properly done to ours and others' satisfaction as well. In this case, the acrylic paint is very forgiving because I can work over top of everything and block out what's underneath. You can see here that I'm now painting in the letters, and I've chosen this washed out yellow sort of cream color that I mixed up. I used quite a bit of white and quite a bit of yellow and just a little bit of violet to tone it down so that it wasn't quite so bright a cream. And I chose this color because I knew that it would not only be light enough to be seen against the greens, but also would contrast with the blues and violets of the sky. And I want to make sure that I have as much contrast as I can. I may lose a little bit of it along the edges, but I think if I put it in here nicely, it will work relatively well. You'll also see that I'm painting from the inside of the letters whenever I can. I'm very careful not to put my hand in the wet paint in any area. But if I work from the outside or the edges of the letters, sometimes I can get a sloppy edge. But if I always work from the inside of the line, working towards the outside edge, I can actually focus my attention better at the tip of the brush. Also, you may notice that I'm putting multiple coats on this. It took me actually about 3 coats for this to fully cover what was underneath it. If I wanted a translucent effect, I definitely had it if I only put 1 or 2 coats on there. But putting 3 or 4 coats on there allows me to block out everything below it and give nice solid letters. And again, with this paint, it's the white that I mixed in with it that's actually allowing me to block things out. The other colors that I use to mix this are translucent, and they will be translucent for many, many coats. The only reason that I needed to use actually 4 coats on this is because I diluted the white so much. Here then is that finished painting. You can see I've removed the tape, and I have placed it underneath a bright light in order to take a nice clear and squared off photograph of the surface for you to see. For work at this level, presentation and craftsmanship are of the utmost importance. I hope that you take the time and make the effort to present your work well. By comparing my original picture with the painting that I generated from it, you can see that I pushed the atmospheric perspective by lightening up on the colors in the distance and reducing the amount of contrast that I had as things went back, reducing the amount of detail as well. I should probably point out here that the value and contrast of the color is more important to atmospheric perspective than the hue of the color. While the hue will set a mood, it's the value and the contrast that shows us depth. And so, it's time for you to pick up your pencil and pick up your brush. It's your turn to paint a landscape.